You don't seem very fiery to me. You
I
seem like
get
you might just.
crazy. I get
Oh,
crazy. Yeah.
okay.
You don't want to set.
No one expected the pain to begin after the funeral. When Rob Reiner passed away, Hollywood mourned a legend. Tributes poured in. Old clips resurfaced. His legacy as a filmmaker, activist, and humanitarian was praised as almost untouchable. But behind closed doors inside one grieving family, something far darker was quietly unfolding. When the will was finally read, the room went cold. Roy and Jake Reiner were completely blindsided. Not confused, not uncertain. Blindsided. The entire fortune, an estimated $200 million built over decades of relentless work, iconic films, and the smart investments, was gone. Not divided, not delayed, gone. Every single dollar had already been directed to charitable foundations, education, healthcare, social programs, causes Rob and his wife, Michelle, had supported for years. To the outside world, it looked like the ultimate act of generosity, but to his children, it felt like erasure. In that moment, grief twisted into something sharper. Shock turned into anger. Silence turned into disbelief. Jake, according to sources close to the family, felt like his place in the Reiner story had been quietly rewritten, like the world mattered more than blood, like his parents had chosen a public legacy over their own children. Lawyers were contacted almost immediately, setting off a legal chain reaction that would pull the Reiner name straight into the spotlight. Rob Reiner's 200 board will turns all eye, and as the legal process began, more details started to leak. Nearly 2 weeks after the devastating events of December 14th, 2025, the family was finally able to hold a quiet farewell, but only after the Los Angeles coroner completed all required examinations. By December 19th, official records listed Jake Reiner as the informant on both certificates and the person entrusted with receiving his parents' ashes. Rob and Michelle Reiner were cremated. The service took place at Mount Sinai Mortuary in the Hollywood Hills, a respected Jewish funeral home known for its deep traditions and discretion. No cameras, no crowds, no spectacle, just a small circle of loved ones standing together in silence. In a deeply personal decision, the ashes were brought to Jake's home. No final resting place had been chosen yet. Some quietly suggested the ashes might one day be scattered somewhere meaningful. Others believed part of them could be placed in a family cemetery. One last chapter, painfully unfinished. But whatever calm existed didn't last. Just days later, photographers captured Roy and Jake stepping into a high-profile Beverly Hills law firm known for handling elite Hollywood inheritance disputes. Dressed in dark clothing, sunglasses pulled low, faces drained of color, they said nothing as cameras flashed and questions were shouted. Those images spread instantly. Headlines exploded with the speculation about a $200 million inheritance battle. People asked why lawyers were involved so quickly, why there had been no public announcement, whether the will had even been officially validated yet. Inside those walls, grief was no longer private, and just when the tension felt unbearable, new information surfaced. Information that would change everything. The revelation didn't arrive with a press release. It slipped out quietly through sources close to the family, and when it did, it hit like a punch to the chest. Nearly the entire $200 million fortune had already been redirected long before the will was read. Not set aside, not pending distribution, already assigned to charitable foundations. According to a longtime family friend, this decision wasn't impulsive and it wasn't driven by anger or punishment. It was driven by a belief he had carried for years. He believed children should stand on their own. To him, inherited wealth, especially excessive wealth, could dull ambition, weaken resilience, and quietly steal purpose. He often spoke about independence, about how struggle shapes character in ways comfort never can. Friends recalled him saying that his children needed to build their own paths, not walk on one paved with his money. But his thinking wasn't uniform. With Nick, who had faced deep personal struggles, he believed financial comfort could actually do more harm than good. One close friend explained it bluntly. In his mind, handing over large sums to someone still battling emotional demons would be like throwing fuel onto an open fire. Life, he believed, was the real teacher. Work, consequences, responsibility. Jake and Roy were different. He saw independence in them, strength. Jake had carved out a steady career and a life of his own. Roy was deeply immersed in her creative work, building something piece by piece. He would even joke to friends, "My kids can handle it. They're stronger than people think." For him, success wasn't measured by what was left behind, but by whether his children could keep moving forward without a safety net. That belief shaped everything. Long before his passing, his intentions were crystal clear. Nearly all of his wealth was earmarked for charity. He didn't just talk about it, he acted. Sources say he personally entrusted Roy with overseeing the sale of the Brentwood home and other properties, with every dollar flowing directly into the causes he and Michelle had supported for decades: education, healthcare, social programs. One family friend later recalled a quiet conversation that now feels almost prophetic. Parents aren't here to build the road for their kids. They're here to teach them how to walk on their own. But philosophy feels very different when it becomes reality. When the truth finally sank in that none of the children were left a single cent, the emotional fallout was immediate. This wasn't just paperwork. This was grief turning into resistance. Inside that Beverly Hills law firm, sources say disbelief filled the room. Roy reportedly broke down, overwhelmed, whispering that it wasn't fair. Jake reacted differently. Raw, explosive, wounded. He allegedly said their parents chose to care for the world, but forgot their own children. Those words weren't about greed. They came from pain, from feeling erased, from believing their place in the family story had been quietly removed. What followed was inevitable. They began exploring every possible legal path: trust structures, timelines, clauses, anything that could be challenged. Soon, a heavyweight legal team was assembled, specialists known for brutal Hollywood inheritance battles. At their first meeting, one attorney didn't sugarcoat it. "If you want fairness," he warned, "this will be long, and it will be brutal." Jake didn't hesitate. "We're not afraid," he said. "We've already lost everything." And with that, the fight truly began. Behind closed doors, the siblings' intentions became impossible to ignore. This was no longer about a share, not about negotiation, not about quiet acceptance. They wanted everything returned to the family. As meetings stretched late into the night, the legal strategy hardened. The plan was aggressive and deeply personal. Challenge the charitable foundations directly, arguing that their parents' final decisions had severed the children from any real connection to the family legacy. Roy, usually the quieter presence, was just as unshakable. According to those in the room, her voice barely rose when she said it, but the meaning landed hard. She didn't want a portion. She wanted it all. In her mind, their parents were gone, and what remained was an unbearable sense of abandonment. The attorneys warned them carefully. Going after public charities would not stay contained. It would trigger backlash. It would drag their parents' names into controversy and permanently reshape how the world remembered them. The same legacy built on compassion and justice could be torn apart in public. Jake didn't hesitate. Public opinion, he said, wasn't his family. From that moment, the conflict stopped being just legal. It became emotional warfare. Teams began combing through private journals, old emails, handwritten notes, anything that could suggest those final decisions didn't fully reflect their father's emotional estate near the end. One lawyer framed it bluntly during a tense strategy session. This isn't just about money. This is about redefining what your father's legacy really means. And that was the truth. What unfolded wasn't simply a courtroom battle. It was a collision between love and resentment, the very principles their father had lived by, independence, self-reliance, accountability, had now become the spark for rebellion. For Jake and Roy, this stopped being about lessons or philosophy. It became about never getting the chance to ask why. Outside, the world continued to honor a man celebrated for generosity and moral conviction. Inside the family, everything was coming apart over the same ideals he believed would make them stronger. One close friend later said something that captured the tragedy perfectly. He trusted they would understand. He just didn't live long enough to see that they weren't ready. And just like that, the will became more than a legal document. It became a wound. Proof that even the most well-intended choices can leave scars no inheritance can ever heal. To understand why this decision felt so final, so unmovable, you have to step away from the courtroom and look at the life Rob Reiner actually lived. For decades, philanthropy wasn't something he added at the end of his career. It was woven into everything. Long before the will became public, Rob and his wife Michelle were known in quiet circles as one of Hollywood's most deeply committed social impact couples. Not symbolic donors, not names on plaques, they built movements. One of their most meaningful projects focused on early childhood development. They believed the first years of life shaped everything that followed: emotional health, education, even empathy. Through educational campaigns and nonprofit initiatives, they reached millions of parents, reshaping how an entire generation understood early learning. But they didn't stop there. Rob pushed science into policy. He helped bring neuroscience and child psychology into legislative conversations, forcing lawmakers to confront how early neglect echoes for a lifetime. One of his most ambitious efforts led to a statewide initiative that redirected public funds into early childhood health and education, ultimately channeling billions toward children who would never know his name. Equality was another line he never stopped crossing. He stood at the center of movements challenging discriminatory laws, lending not just his platform, but his time, his money, and his credibility. While others spoke, he organized. While others donated, he stayed involved. Courtrooms, policy meetings, long strategy sessions, he was there. Behind the scenes, Michelle was the engine. She coordinated campaigns, mobilized artists, managed press, and ensured every message carried heart instead of noise. Friends often said Rob was the voice, but Michelle was the structure. Together, they believed charity should be effective, not performative. Even in entertainment, purpose came first. Private charity as screenings, fundraisers disguised as film events, documentaries that challenged power, faith, and politics. They blurred the line between storytelling and activism, believing art was useless if it didn't move people toward empathy. What most people never saw was how hands-on they were. They read reports line by line, debated budgets, sat through exhausting meetings with educators, social workers, and researchers. They didn't lend names, they lent labor. So when news broke that nearly all of Rob's wealth had been set aside for charity, those close to him weren't shocked. It fit. Generosity to him wasn't about comfort, it was about responsibility. And that's what made the family conflict so devastating. Because the same causes that defined his life were now positioned against his own children. Outside the family, his legacy looked intact, even noble. Inside, that legacy felt like a wall no one knew how to climb. And the hardest truth of all, Rob likely believed this was love. A final lesson, a vote of confidence in his children's strength. But love, when left unexplained, can feel exactly like abandonment. Before it became the center of a family fracture, the fortune itself had a long, deliberate history. Nothing about it was accidental. Rob's journey began in front of the camera, where early acting success turned him into a familiar face in American homes. But the real transformation happened when he stepped behind the scenes. Directing wasn't just a creative shift, it was a financial turning point. Film after film became more than cultural moments. They became machines, romantic comedies that defined generations, thrillers that dominated box offices, courtroom dramas that turned into permanent fixtures of popular culture. At the height of his career, Rob wasn't just collecting directing fees, he was securing back-end profit participation, money that kept flowing long after theaters went dark. Then came the move that changed everything. He co-founded a production company that would quietly reshape television and film. What followed were legendary projects, shows and movies that never stopped earning. When the company was later sold and restructured, Rob walked away with a massive payout tied to ownership, not just labor. Real estate multiplied the impact. In the early 1990s, he purchased a Brentwood home that steadily climbed into eight-figure territory. A beachfront Malibu property followed, tucked inside one of the most exclusive coastal enclaves in California. It wasn't just a retreat. It became a high-demand rental generating a staggering monthly income. Layer by layer, the empire grew. Luxury properties across prime Los Angeles neighborhoods, long-term royalties from films that never left rotation, streaming platforms, syndication, international licensing. Each check, a small on its own, devastatingly powerful when stacked across decades. One of his most significant late-life financial victories came from reclaiming control over a cult classic project that had been locked in a bitter dispute for years. When the settlement finally came through, it restored not just creative rights, but a steady revenue stream that dramatically strengthened his portfolio. Rob wasn't reckless with money. He diversified, balanced entertainment income with conservative investments, stocks, stable assets, long-term planning. Even during periods when he stepped back from directing, the machine kept running. And throughout it all, Michelle was there, not just a spouse, a strategist. She co-produced, advised, questioned deals, and helped steer major financial decisions. Friends often said she protected the family from the financial traps that swallow so many Hollywood fortunes. By the time everything was tallied, films, television, real estate, royalties, investments, the number was staggering. Nearly 200 million. A fortune built on imagination, discipline, and decades of relentless work. And that's where the irony cuts deepest. Everything he spent a lifetime building, everything designed to provide security, became the source of the greatest pain his family would ever experience. Because when the will surfaced, it didn't just redirect money, it redirected meaning. To the world, it looked like generosity at its highest level. To his children, it felt like distance, like being excluded from his final gesture of love. Was this his way of teaching independence one last time? Or was it shaped by emotional gaps no amount of success could ever close? Those questions still hang in the air, unanswered, unresolved. After the lawyers left and the doors closed, silence took over. Not the peaceful kind, the heavy kind, the kind that forces you to sit with questions that have no answers. For Jake and Roy, the fight wasn't just happening in legal offices. It followed them home, into empty rooms, into memories that now felt sharper than comfort ever could. Every childhood moment replayed differently, filtered through one unbearable thought. Was this really how our parents saw us at the end? Friends noticed the change almost immediately. Jake grew more withdrawn, carrying a quiet anger that surfaced in flashes. Not rage for money, but for meaning. For the feeling that his parents' final message had been delivered without explanation, without a chance to respond. Roy carried it differently. Her grief was softer, but heavier. A slow ache that settled into everyday life, making even ordinary moments feel fragile. What haunted them most wasn't the loss of wealth. It was the loss of dialogue. There was no last conversation, no clarification, no chance to say, "We understand," or "help us understand." Inside the family, memories became contradictions. Moments of love clashed with a decision that felt final, unmovable. Some days, they tried to believe it was faith, a belief in their strength. Other days, it felt like distance disguised as principle. Outside, the world moved on, articles praised generosity, commentators applauded conviction. The narrative was clean, almost inspiring. A man who gave everything to the greater good. A life that ended exactly as it was lived. But inside the family, nothing felt clean. Because generosity, when it collides with grief, doesn't always feel noble. Sometimes it feels like being left behind. The hardest truth slowly surfaced. Two things could exist at once. A father could love deeply and still leave pain behind. And that realization changed everything, because this was no longer just a dispute over money or legacy. It became a story about how love is interpreted, how values are passed down, and how silence at the end can echo louder than words spoken over a lifetime. In time, the legal battle would move forward. Arguments would be made, decisions would come. But none of that could answer the question that mattered most to the people at the center of it all. Was this meant to be a lesson or a goodbye they were never meant to understand? And perhaps the most painful part of all, some questions don't get resolved in courtrooms. They live on quietly in the hearts of the ones left behind. Once the story went fully public, it stopped belonging to the family. It became a debate. Headlines spread fast, framed in sharp and emotional language. Some called the decision visionary. Others called it cruel. Social media filled with arguments from people who had never met Rob. yet felt certain they understood his intentions better than his own children. Two sides formed almost overnight. On one side were those who praised the choice. They called it the ultimate act of principle, proof that he lived exactly as he preached. To them, directing his fortune toward education, equality, and healthcare wasn't abandonment. It was consistency, a final stand against entitlement in a world obsessed with inherited privilege. On the other side were voices filled with discomfort. They asked harder questions, not legal ones, human ones. Could generosity toward strangers ever justify leaving nothing to your own children? Did belief in independence erase the need for emotional closure? And was it fair to turn a family's private grief into a public moral lesson? The debate grew louder by the day. Talk shows weighed in. Commentators dissected his past interviews, searching for clues. Old quotes resurfaced, repurposed to support opposing arguments. Every sentence he had ever spoken about responsibility or self-reliance was suddenly treated like evidence. But something was missing from every discussion: the children. Their voices were almost entirely absent. While the world argued philosophy, Jake and Roy stayed silent. No statements, no interviews, no social media responses. Their silence was interpreted in every possible way: guilt, anger, strategy, grief, depending on who was doing the talking. And that silence became its own message. It reminded people that this wasn't a thought experiment. It was a family fracture playing out in real time, a reminder that legacies don't belong only to history books. They live inside real relationships. Slowly, the image of Rob Reiner began to shift, not collapse, but bend. He was still celebrated for his films, his activism, his impact, but now his story carried complexity, a reminder that moral clarity in public life doesn't always translate cleanly inside the home. For some, this made his legacy a stronger, more honest, more human. For others, it introduced an ache that admiration alone couldn't resolve, and at the center of it all sat one uncomfortable truth. A legacy isn't just what you give to the world. It's what the people closest to you feel when you're gone. As weeks passed, the question lingered, not in courtrooms, but in conversations everywhere. Did this decision redefine generosity or redefine distance? And would time soften the edges or make them sharper? The world kept asking. The family kept living with it. In the end, there was no clean conclusion, no dramatic courtroom moment that suddenly made everything make sense, no single ruling that healed the emotional damage left behind. The legal process moved forward slowly, methodically, but the deeper conflict lived somewhere law could never reach. Because this story was never truly about money, it was about interpretation. To some, Rob's final decision will always look like courage, a man so committed to his values that he refused to compromise, even when it hurt. To others, it will always feel like distance, a final act that left too much unsaid, too much unresolved. Both versions can exist at the same time. That's the uncomfortable truth. A parent can believe they are teaching a strength, while a child feels they are being abandoned. A legacy can uplift millions, while quietly breaking the people closest to it. For Jake and Roy, the future remains uncertain. Whether the legal fight ends in victory, loss, or settlement, one thing is already decided: their relationship with their parents' memory has been permanently altered. Love and resentment now sit side by side, impossible to fully separate, and maybe that's the lesson no one wants to admit. that even the most carefully planned legacy can fail to land the way it was intended, that values passed down without conversation can feel like judgment instead of trust, and that silence at the end can echo louder than a lifetime of words. Rob believed independence was the greatest gift a parent could give, but this story leaves behind a quieter question, one without a clear answer. Is a strength something you give your children or something you build with them? That question lingers in living rooms, in comment sections, in families quietly watching this story and wondering what they would do differently. Because when everything is stripped away, the money, the fame, the arguments, what remains is painfully simple. A family loved each other, a choice was made, and the consequences will be felt long after the headlines fade. And maybe that's why this story refuses to end, because legacies don't stop at wills. They live on in memory, interpretation, and the space between intention and impact, where love, no matter how sincere, can still leave scars.